from India. Suraj is the author of the best-selling book, Caste Matters, and a postdoctoral fellow for the Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Initiative at the Shorenstein Center. Suraj is India's first Dalit Ph.D. holder from an African university, University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg in the nation's history. And he is a published author in the field of caste, race, and ethnic studies, amongst many articles that he's published. He's also focused on interregional labor migration and the Global South. Suraj also holds a research associate position with the Department of African and African American Studies here at Harvard, and a non-resident fellow at the Hutchins Center. Currently, he is involved in developing a critical theory of Dalit and Black Studies, and something that I think we will be able to talk a little bit through. So with that, we're going to get started with our discussion. And the first question I have is, just because we're at Harvard doesn't mean that we know everything. So why don't you give us a working definition of caste, Suraj, so that everyone knows what this term is as we move forward in our conversation.
Thank you so much, Khalil, and thank you everybody for showing up in these busy times and packing the room. When I came about 10-15 minutes ago, there were a few people, and I thought, okay, that's good. It's better. I would like to really acknowledge two of my academic mentors here at the Kennedy School who really helped me shape my thinking and really offered me the desired confidence and, in a way, a push to be controversial but truthful, and as well as to be straightforward. One is Professor William Julius Wilson, who just retired, and we celebrated him. His class and his engagements really helped me to think about myself in a way that is not necessarily only be the victim of my own conscience, but it's also a structural outcome that I am put into. And structure has a meaning as much as it has culture has meaning, and I think he has shaped, and the controversy his book has had, and the negative reviews I got, I was very disappointed with some of the reviews I got. And then I see him, and then I feel good about it. So thank you for being the way you are, and Khalil for really trusting in this project. He's been in this project, especially on the issues of caste, for long, way back in Indiana, and since on he has not lost his interest, and more importantly, for loving the people. I think his love is unabashed, and that is something that transcends into even my scholarship, because I aspire to be something like that. And I think being a black scholar in an institution like Harvard itself is, I would assume, a minority status where there's not many people to echo voice and still continue to be truthful to the cause and calling it. I think I'll learn a lot. So thank you, Khalil, for being there and providing the push. So caste is basically, if you go theoretical understanding of caste, it's a very misunderstood concept. Primarily, it originates in the hereditary order of Hinduism. So there is a theory that kind of supports something, Aryan invasion, the Eurasians who came into India, and there's always conflict. Caste system was something that rigidified an existence of occupational status. You are born into a caste, you live into a caste, and you die into a caste. Even your graveyard has your caste, so it doesn't go. And when you reproduce, you also reproduce caste. So there is no escape. And if you are on the privileged side of a caste, you continue to enjoy the privileges, and you develop new theories and new understandings of how to preserve it. You provide a very nuanced understanding of how beautiful of a system it is and how organized structure it is.
You're getting ahead of yourself.
And then when you're oppressed, you literally want to blow it up. And that's what I'm trying to do with the caste.
Yeah, there's a line, you call it cultural suicide bomber. So that, I think, gets us started. I mean, I think one of the questions that we might have in the U.S. context, which I know for me as a student of this and learning a lot from you, it's hard to not draw the parallels. And so we'll use the pure parallels as a kind of heuristic to help connect the dots and be as aggressive as possible in making those distinctions so that we don't collapse meaningful differences between how we understand racism. But one of the things that I think I've learned is that skin color plays more of a role in caste, and that might defy our working definition of the hereditary origins. Maybe talk a little bit about the spectral range of casteism, since people are making decisions about who's in what caste based on
That's right. I mean, it's not as apparent as you see in race because the contrast of colors is, and I think this is again a mythical characterization of early colonial kind of dynamism. And of course, America becomes a very prominent space to give us a strict definition of a race, which itself is defeating. But again, I mean, I take a cue from Du Bois because Du Bois informs me a lot how to engage with this scientifically, polemically, as well as radically, frankly. And so, with the race and caste, for example, caste, you might have a light skin, a person from Kashmir, and he or she might still be an untouchable. And you might go to the South India because of the variation it has, and there is still an untouchable in society. So each society, organic society in India, has managed to produce untouchables, the labor, the undignified they produced in the production chain, so that they tend to have no ownership. What we call social relations. And one of the contrasts between slavery and untouchability era is slaves were product that needed to be sold. So a certain amount of investment, whatever it may be, of whatever worth that the slave owner had to do with that product, which was commodity in its excellence. Whereas in untouchables case, you were not given the status of a labor, let alone a human. So you could be anybody. And tomorrow if you don't work for me, that wouldn't harm me because I've not bought you. The system has given me a right that you are totally tied to me not only for one generation, two generation, for as long as the cosmological servility, as I call it, continues. And therefore, in the caste formation, what happens is there are multiple subdivisions. So how do you, I mean, if there is a caste on the top and we have 4 prominent divisions, 1, 2, 3, 4, and the 5th are untouchables. Now one thing is, how can the top person go and control the bottommost? So what they did was they reproduced castes, multiple castes in a plural sense, in each strata. And so that strata aspires. And the authority given by the what I call Brahminic ritualism, which is basically caste is a ritual order, and because it is ritually purified or ritually sanctioned, it holds, people hold dear to it because you might not have a food to it, but if you have a faith or a ritual that helps you to think about certain dynamics of life, that's how the oppressed people continue to remain attracted to the kind of caste dynamics because it is offering you something, not in this life, but and that's whole the bullshit of karma theory comes into place.
Did you just say bullshit?
Yeah. Yes.
So I have a broader question that picks up on this theme and advances a little bit, and that is, what is new about your critique of caste? But before you answer, I want to give a quote from your book, which I think will help to refine what I think is something you're offering. You write, the society and the Dalit have been juxtaposed to co-opt Dalits into the imperial project of Hindu globalism. It is similar to the proclamation of US empire, where black slaves were the constituent elements in forming the country. The Dalit is a major feature in the making of a universalist Hindu claim. Persons belonging to castes higher than Dalits draw their higher human caste legitimacy by keeping untouchables below them. And just to put one more finer spin on it, it reminds me, your critique here, of Baldwin in responding to an interviewer. What white people have to do is try and figure out in their own hearts why it was necessary to have an N-word in the first place. Because I am not one, I am a man, but if you think I am, it means you need it. And so this notion that Hinduism itself, the very nation, can't exist without Dalits seems to be something you're offering. Is that entirely your offering, or is this part of a larger kind of conversation you're having with others?
I mean, when I think about the existence of India, I mean, you see, it's this human equilibrium. You know, we are the feet according to the the birth-based kind of origins. So if you cut the feet, the body would not exist. Similarly, the entirety of Indian nation would not exist if untouchables cease to exist. So it is upon the behest of the people who are running the country or controlling the resources for them to have untouchables at their disposal. If there is no untouchable, there is no India. And that's why Gandhi was so insistent on maintaining the caste system. Because if untouchables go, the labor go, then who will replace them? Because the jobs that untouchables were given were of impure status, were filthy. when unworthy of dignity. So who will take that job? No one wants to be indignified into that job. And that's why the entire nationalist project of India was ensuring the subordinate status of untouchables into the society. And now, if one has to be wishful thinking of a utopia, what would happen if there are no untouchables? And people always ask me. And I think if there are no untouchables, there is no society that we can call broadly in South Asian terms, because the origin of a structural society comes from the origin of untouchability. And every capitalist or non-capitalist society needs a labor that is permanently wretched, so that the system kind of continues. And the permanent wretchedness is observed in an untouchable labor who remains at the most margins. Meaning, if you look at the educational status, not more than 4% Dalits are graduate with university degrees. So rest, the 96% are the ones who are begging on the streets, who are doing all kinds of manual labor. They are manual scavengers. Every third day, a Dalit dies picking someone else's shit. So this is the kind of statistics we live under, and this grossly remains to be in a liberal as well as radical framework, a justifying factor for us to have caste as a system.
So this raises, obviously, I imagine people's synapses are firing in 1,000 directions right now for all that you just said. But let's take the sort of alternative possibility at face value, which is, what would it mean to no longer have untouchability? And one could, again, analogize what would it mean to no longer have racism, or the embodied black body as the sill upon which everyone steps on to their American dream. That being said, and I'm offering this just as a reaction, but what comes to mind in my head is that we might imagine a lottery where having been born into Brahminism does not guarantee you your 4% or your majoritarian leadership role. And the same is true in the United States. That what makes racism a salient feature, even with a black president having come and gone, is that there are much higher possibilities that those who carry blackness and brown on their skin will simply end up at the lowest orders and registers of our society. But we could imagine a society where the state went out of its way to create a sense of randomness to life chances. But given that privilege is, in fact, inherited in this country by virtue of social advantage, and privilege is inherited in India by virtue of both heritage, is not heretical, inherited status, there's a lot to give up. And you talk a lot about what it means to give that up.
That's right. To just connect with your previous question also, see, what is happening with the Indian context right now, it's a very terrible scenario. And now we might place it into political conduits, the rise of Modi, right-wing populism, fascism. And if you ask someone like me, I'm thinking this is not a news for me. This has always been there. It's just that it is affecting on a different scale and different ideology kind of operating. This becomes a news. But then, the incarceration of my people and the people I grew up with continues to happen. And recently, when I was back home, the guy I grew up with was incarcerated under some frivolous charges, and he was sent to central prison, what they call, meaning he's gone and I may not see him another 15, 20 years if he doesn't get a good lawyer. And so this scenario, I was thinking 10 years ago, and they were still happening. I was also on the police watch list because we belong to that hood. I grew up in a Dalit community. So when you connect that with the global sort of Hindu claims, right? It's fascinating that it's been sold as a spiritual renaissance. When you talk about this order and this meditative impulse, without even discussing about the inherent what makes Hindu a Hindu, or what makes a nation state of India a India. It's almost like an American going and talking all about great things and without even mentioning the word race.
Oh, that's every day.
And this exact kind of the linear kind of lessons they are learning. For example, Kennedy School, right? I mean, when it admits all the Brahmins or the elites from India who claim, and it's very ironical that you continue to enjoy the privileges. You own immense amount of land. You come from 5, 6, 10 generations of education, accumulated wealth, and shamelessly you have the audacity to come into the audience and claim the space that belongs to the rightful African Americans or the people of that origin, try to fall into the ranks of them, while in fact, if you fail, you will go and end up on 35th floor apartment that you have in Bombay or in Delhi. And so this kind of person of coloring of this Brahmins is actually failing the entire project and taking away the struggles of people, because by the virtue of just showing up, and how come you show up to an elite institution like Harvard? You have certainly had an accumulated privilege. And I think when these people, the supposed ambassadors to kind of connect these issues to us, do not at all engage with this criticality and end up talking about the issues that have very little to do with the lived reality. This is a theoretical reading that they might have done a day before yesterday or the later. And so today, if you talk about yoga, if you talk about, I mean, we say we don't need yoga, we're always working hard. I mean, our physical labor is involved, especially in the fields and farms, and so we have to pay attention to how this is being manifested in contemporary terms. If we do not pay attention to that, tomorrow it is going to, and it is already a legitimate order, where Modi visits Texas, and Trump shows up, and there's called a bonhomie happening there, even without promoting the cause of actual human rights. And by the way, 300 million Dalits live in India, 300 million untouchables, almost like in America, and yet we know absolutely nothing about. And Harvard even doesn't teach or discuss about this issue, and supposedly creating institutions and world leaders promoting human and civil rights. And I think this is hypocrisy at its best when you sit at the center of empire project where you want to involve, and it's almost like this octopus having multiple hands and putting your elitism to suppress the other potential voices that might take you down.
Well, so you get a sense of the stakes here, right? There's no question that the stakes are high for what Suraj is setting out to do and what this book accomplishes, and everyone won't agree, to be sure. Before we go further, I do want to back up just a little bit and give just a tiny bit of biographical detail, because this is not just an academic study. This is a study that really draws on Suraj's firsthand experiences and tells stories of many others from his community. How do you pronounce your home, Nandi?
Nandi.
Nandi. So, and just to shout out, Suraj was featured by WGBH in a series, Caste in America, that was produced by PRI, Public Radio International, and you can find the interview online, and you can see pictures from the reporter who followed Suraj to this home. Oh, great, yes. Tell me your name again. Phil Park, yes. So thank you for that. Thank you for coming out today. So you describe many scenes. You tell the story of your parents' arranged marriage and what that meant for your mother in particular. You talk about the difficulties of your father having a kind of intellectual aspiration, but being very much pigeonholed into the work of a laborer. You also talk about the resistance that he embodied as a Dalit Panther, and maybe share a little bit about what that means, because it might be hitting folks' ears for the first time, given the connection to the Panther Party here in the United States. But you also tell this incredibly powerful scene, your kind of coming of age to your own untouchability, which is a kind of story that we hear in the genre of African American storytelling when they first were called the N-word, or they first realized that their white playmates would no longer play with them. And this has to do with you needing to go to the bathroom. Maybe tell that story.
So, my upbringing was like many other. So we in India, we have few categories when we define a person's socioeconomic status. So one is upper rich class, or whatever they have the word, the top class. Then there is a middle class. That's a significant amount of population. Then there is lower middle class. Then there is an index, I think, that describes the poverty. And then there is another called below poverty. And so below poverty is below poverty. And so my family grew up in below poverty index, which means the below poverty level is described depending upon whichever state you are, but it's basically gestures to you are not sure if you'll have your next month's income. And so the government made this category so they can redistribute some of the grains and for the people to feed upon, and this is called rationing. So we were relying on rationing. And so when I was growing up in this family, I went as a 9 or 10-year-old to my grandma, who was a servant. She was a servant. Many feminists disagree with me in India. They say, why do you call servant? Call her help. I said, that might feel good for your upper caste conscience, but my grandmother was a servant. She was, cleaning the toilets. So as a 10-year-old, I wanted to follow her. And so I kept walking, and she refused to take me because I just wanted to see what she does. And every night when she comes, she brings food, which is more delicious, which has more spices, because that's where she would get the leftovers and bring to our house. So one day I just followed her, and then secretly, and one day I just showed up to the gate of the people who she was working at, and then her face was pale. She just couldn't take it, and because she did not wanted her grandchild to see that what kind of job she was doing. And so I showed up, and then she's now very uncomfortable, she's sweating, and then she's trying to make sure the lady who she works for doesn't see that I am there, because then that's another burden for her, like, why do you bring people? And because they are afraid that she might steal something and give to me to feed from the kitchen. So that's the more fear. So I never enter the house. So the house, the bathroom she's cleaning is on the outskirts, meaning they have a big yard, and there's a bathroom outside, and so she's cleaning, and then I say, I gotta go pee as a 10-year-old, and she's like, no, wait, we will go very shortly, and she's like, no. Then finally she gives in, and then I go. I am there probably 20-30 seconds, but for 20-30 seconds I can see my grandma constantly, almost like patrolling. She is unstable. She is making sure that the landlady doesn't catch, or the person she works with doesn't catch us, because then that's going to be costing her job and insults and everything. I think later she told me she was more afraid of the insults that lady would hurl at her in presence of me, and that would have been, unfathomable for her. So for that 30 seconds, I was thinking to myself, I'm just taking a piss. And even that is not, an untouchable's piss is not acceptable into a upper caste household. And that's where the scene kind of totally, blanked upon me, and then that's where it went very straight to my heart. And then as soon as I finished the piece, she immediately almost like whisked me out, almost showing that nothing happened here, and then she went to the bathroom, cleaned it, and happened. And then the lady saw. And this time, my grandma almost looked at her, and then I thought they had some conversations, but she just took me and we left. She didn't even have a conversation, because she knew that what's going to be the outcome. And then we left, and I don't think she ever went to that job, because she knew she's not going to get that job.
Yeah. There's a passage I want to share, which is the other side of childhood. So here, Suraj has just described a kind of a very prominent theme in his own memory, which colors the stories that he tells, and he tells others, both at the university, about meeting other students as you were in England, and then here at the Kennedy School. But this is the other side of the story, and that is that you're right, casteism is the longest thriving pathology known to mankind, conjuring differences between human beings out of thin air and claiming they are based on birth, and then ascribing them a certain social status is a testament to seriously compromised mental and social health. A child is taught to be different from others. The question of one's differences is emphasized so strongly that the child follows it without necessarily making critical inquiries. The child is mentored by the entire family to harbor the feeling of otherness towards others who are most likely inferior or lower in the socioeconomic ladder. The prejudicial attitudes that a child is brought up with prepares it to be harmful towards others. Natural innocence ruthlessly taken away by the oppressive minds in the family. Later, as time passes, when the child becomes an adult, he or she is told misleadingly by society that differences don't exist. The historian and her sister sociologist, Barbara and Karen Fields, call this racecraft with regard to the justification for the material condition of oppression that people experience. And so, as we've already described, the untouchability creates material realities, and then the layers of justification, what you call conjuring difference out of thin air, becomes the narrative that these other children tell themselves about why your classmates and the children that you grew up with are different and deserving of their position in society. So let's talk a little bit about what is missing in our epistemologies of Dalit community. You spend a great deal of time in this work, following, to some degree, Du Bois's tradition. you give us a much richer tableau of who are Dalits. And so let's just spend a few minutes talking about the community itself, because it's obviously not monolithic.
That's right. So, I mean, the erstwhile untouchables in the modern lexicon adopted an identity which was basic, it was very much inspired with the tradition of Black Panthers. And so we had our own version of Dalit Panthers, which my dad was part of. Actually, my name was given by one of the co-founders of Dalit Panthers, which was a different, it's a different name than Suraj. It was a difficult Marathi jargon. It was called Suraj, which is kind-hearted. But people couldn't pronounce it, so I kind of compromised with Suraj. and my dad didn't like that. So the Dalit Panthers kind of brought a radical identity to Dalits, where they said the Dalit literally means broken people, these people who are broken. And I think Brian Stevenson offers a very profound definition of broken people when he talks about the incarcerated people here. And I think he talks about this as, he almost kind of makes it a religious concept where, if you're broken, it can be repaired. And I think, I was, when he was speaking, he speaks multiple times about that brokenness. And when I think in contemporary era, I mean, the existence of Dalit is victimized, but also it is used by the Brahminical regimes to victimize other Dalits. And so there are this huge kind of class differences. And that classness doesn't feature as much into our entirety of understanding of this, because if you bring in class issue, then you will also talk about class issue of the oppressor. Right now what is happening is we are talking only about the caste system A-classness, meaning giving it a pure sociological definition without even talking about those nuances. And I think that has what kept the fight against, or the revolutionary dynamism afloat. Because in India, even the so-called communists or the leftists are Brahmins. And Ambedkar said the secular or radical Brahmins are like the body of one, same body, two hands. One gets hurt, other will come to rescue, and that has drastically happened. And the early communists, or as well as the liberals that were fighting for, they had a very prejudicial, stereotypical understanding of Dalits, and they always wanted to work for Dalits, not work with Dalits. And I think this...
Or work on behalf of Dalits.
Also on behalf of, so when they went to this International Congress of Socialist Conferences, they went and they talked about Dalits, and without even accounting to any presence of that. What that did was, the creative life of Dalits, like we don't know about the Dalit culture, the kind of festivals, the kind of food we eat. If you go on Indian television channel and you switch on a commercial, you will see the commercials that are selling Brahmin foods. And by the way, Brahmins or Brahminical, so Brahmins, for example, India is living in a very declared apartheid. It is not mentioned. So
Say that word again about apartheid, the word before apartheid.
It is a undeclared apartheid.
Undeclared.
Because when we talk about this, when you look at apartheid, which is where I went to study also, Brahmins are close to 3 to 3.5% of India's population. They control 56% of resources. 100% temples. Now temples is a source of wealth as well as social power. Because you might not have toilets in Indian villages, but you will have a temple. You might not have libraries or books, but you will have a temple. And that temple is absolutely controlled by one caste, which is Brahmin. And Brahmins, of course, have 550 divisions, which they have very, very effectively, placed them in various jobs. So 3 to 3.5% of population controlling 56% of resources is actually a call for people to think, where are the rest of the resources? And so when we talk today, the top 10% of Indians, wealth-wise, own more than 85% of India's wealth. And in this kind of caste-class dynamics, we don't tend to talk about these particular issues that are giving rise to this cosmopolitan capitalism that we have in India, which I call cosmo-casteism, because multiple castes gang up to ensure that the subjugation of these bodies remains continued. Because if you give a dignity to the untouchable, you have nowhere else to find that dignity. Based on someone else's misery, you derive the pleasure. It is a sadomachismo that the Brahminic system gives. Every day, it's a statistics of crime record. 3 Dalit women are raped. If you don't hear that news, as an upper caste, feel that something is losing in your mind. Something wrong is happening. You need these dead bodies to be slain. You need these people to be slain, and they put you on the streets. Until unless this doesn't happen, the existence of a caste order doesn't work. It is not a peaceful system. It's a violent order at its best. And for the violence to maintain, you need the perpetrators of violence. Someone has to come in. Now, a Brahmin might not necessarily step down out of temple and start shooting. So they have outsourced their job, as I said, in various categories. And that's why it gets very complex as to where do you draw the hammer. And that's why my critique is against Brahmins, as well as the dominant caste people who hold on to those principles, because they are not willing to let go of their power, privileges, and prestige that is responsible for the misery of the 300 million people in India.
So this is really, I mean, again, I know that, and we're going to move towards Q&A in the next 5 to 7 minutes, so get your questions together. I have 1,000 more questions just from what he's saying than what I prepared to ask, so I know you have some as well. But I want to spend just a minute longer on what we might recognize as class within the Dalit community, because you talk a lot about it. And part of the tension is that you're describing a Brahminical order which sets the standard for how people see themselves relative to each other, even within the Dalit community. This might be the equivalent here of how we talk about anti-blackness as an organizing principle for American society. So while white supremacy, for example, might get expressed in the alt-right or other terrorist organizations or occasionally from the mouth of the president, it is anti-blackness that immigrants adopt when they come to our shores, no matter where they come from. It is anti-blackness that explains the most successful black person still being perceived to be a threat. And so you can think about anti-blackness in that sense as the kind of Brahminical order that Suraj is describing. And with that, you talk about, you have 4 categories of Dalits, of which most of them come in for pretty harsh criticism. Token Dalits, elite Dalits, self-obsessed Dalits, and then the last group being radical Dalits. And just to put the critic voice in the space, one criticism describes your book as a, quote, toxic diatribe against salaried Dalits masquerading as ethnography. So what is your beef with salaried Dalits?
I mean, you know, one can go and take a cue from Ambedkar, or take a cue from Du Bois, take a cue from E. Franklin Fraser, Professor Wilson, Cornel West Dew, and many others, you know.
No, I'm not in this.
See, this is a humanist approach. You know, we need to, you know, if we have to tackle the problem, we have to tackle the problem entirely. You know, and that entirety includes the kind of, and very glad you put it, it's a Brahminical project. For example, the token Dalits that I mentioned about, you know, they are the co-opted citizens of a Brahminical world. They are given the passports of that world. So when they become the passport holders of that world, they tend to become the mercenaries in the Dalit worlds, and they are used by this wild forces. Same happens with the elite Dalits. You know, the Dalits, and so when we have the policy of reservation, which is almost loosely framed in affirmative action sense, what it does is it elevates a certain class only. The entire problem that, I mean, if you talk not more than 4% Dalits are graduates, that means affirmative action or reservation, what we call in India, only affects that 4% people. What about the 96% people? I mean, basic resources that we are fighting for. I mean, we don't see a class of these Dalits who sit on a negotiation table with others, where they can ask for this radical demand. They can ask for land, because according to the law, the land belongs to Dalits, and yet Dalit remains landless. 82% of Dalits in India are landless laborers, which means perpetual slavery on the land. So, you know, when we talk in the post-Reconstruction era, the kind of laws were made to enslave the people. Similarly, in post-independence India, the laws have ensured the subjugation of Dalits remain attached to their untouchable, you know, erstwhile status. Whereas today, if they want to claim, even if they want to claim government services, they don't have documents because they have nothing else to fall upon. And if you have a police case against you, and if I have to bail you, I need certain things to ensure that for the bail, I need a document that I have some land. It's a guarantee. Dalits don't have anything of that. So when they are in prison, they are lodged in prison. 49% of Dalits, of all the prisons, of all the population, Dalits and the tribal people occupy 49% of the India's prison. And now the statistics is again debated. Some are claiming more than 55, some are claiming less than that. And so people are asking me what category of Dalits you belong to, because I say I belong to all of them. because in all of the, I am a token Dalit, I'm made tokenized into a hegemonic capitalist Brahminical order. They want someone like me to make them feel good. And then, and then again, I was with a very big philanthropist in India who's a Brahmin woman, and she said, Suraj, I don't like that you constantly mention Brahmin. Can we try to work around this word? And I said, what else do you want me to do? She said, no, you are a scholar, you invent a word. Because she said, I'm a Brahmin, and I would like to help the cause. And I was asking her, how do you want to help the cause? And so at every instance, and within this circle, people are, especially the salaried hypocrites, I call them. For example, this is the class of people who have salaries, and which is good, and I want them to live good life. But my problem is about those people who get too much seduced, even though they are treated inferior in their job status. My point is, if you are not treated well enough at your job status, it's the same condition on a different level. Let's say you belong to a bureaucracy or you belong to a top private company. You cannot own yourself. A Dalit friend who is actually a vice president of a big British company, he's a vice president, he's a Dalit. He said, nobody knows in my company, and that's a British company, that he belongs to a Dalit community. He has a lavish apartment, lavish lifestyle, and he laments every day. The caste system has effectively made sure that the Dalits don't own up to themselves. They don't hang on to their ancestral givings. The first thing they do is, as soon as you enter their world, they try to withdraw all your past, all the contribution you paid, and try to make you someone that has nothing to do with past. And what do you make of that person? That person becomes tokenized, that becomes hypocrite to the entire community.
Yeah. Okay, I do promise we're gonna get to questions. Just my last follow-up. So the symbols of what Suraj is describing, which is the jettisoning of one's past for salaried Dalits, includes what goes on their office walls compared to what goes on in their homes. And so Ambedkar may show up, a version of Ambedkar may show up in the workplace and a different version in the home.
Yes.
There may be leftover presence of Hindu gods in a home that a Dalit ascends to with a kind of Buddha light.
Yes.
And so the symbolism of one's own aspirations to participate in a fuller life in India are very powerful ways in which you are studying these quiet choices that people are making to jettison their past. And so just gonna read a direct quote from a politician, which I think illustrates some of what you're describing. The Politico once told me, quote, "They will never treat us fairly. We should be aware of who we are and not expect more than what is served by the boss. If we rebel now, I am sure he will eliminate me and my family members. They know the grips to keep one in control. They do this by making you a shareholder in some underhand business." And you describe in other examples that these same folks who essentially have been elected to lead the Dalit community are inside of a community of what I would akin to, say, early 20th century machine politicians, that essentially you have to do harm to the very community that you quote unquote represent, because that's the price of the ticket.
I mean, see, one of my problems, right now, in the American context, when I look at America, you have black filmmakers, black pop culture space is created, literary space is there. Almost in every sphere, there is an element of black that is not given, that has been, taken, that has been, people drew inspiration from each other's. And I think that is something that is existing in India, but the Brahminical space is not offering that independence, that autonomy for you to be who you are. Like this philanthropist billionaire lady wanted me to not talk about these issues. And many Dalits again say, why do you hang on to that identity? So it's carrying a stigma. It's carrying a certain sense of subordination. I want to invert it because that is who I am. And in order to do that, we see people are trying to constantly negotiate themselves every day. And how do you negotiate? You negotiate by trying to fit into that world, but also trying to talk a little bit about your community. And in India, for example, in many Indian tech workers, and I did not talk much about them in this book, they talk about how the festivals, which are very much caste-oriented festivals, you talk about Holi, by the way, Holi is a burning of a tribal woman. and that's what the celebration is. And now it gets a very pop culture status, where the real element of that festival, the history. So when we talk about the Columbus Day code, we have similar days that has been celebrated in India, and that gets exported. That's why I'm concerned about the Hindu global order that is exporting all kinds of inexperiences, and then eventually in a generation or two, it gets legitimized, and the story will be erased. The constant struggle of Hinduism when they are fighting against, they call demons, the asuras. Asuras are the people who belong to the native tribe, and the gods are the people who belong to the Brahminical caste. So the constant struggle of natives versus the colonizers has been taking place for more than 2,000 years. And we see that kind of repeated. Now, when you have these humiliations, you open a TV, you don't see your character being represented in a mainstream cinema. There is no Dalit mainstream actor that is claiming his Dalit identity and fighting the enemies. You can find a Muslim character. You can even find, these days, queer characters. You can find characters across the board, except Dalits.
But they're also Dalits. They just have rejected their identity. Some of them.
Yes. Some of them are, and some of them who own up to their identity, and you have to hear their stories. They get almost sidetracked. And so I was wondering one day, Will Smith goes to Bollywood celebration of a festival, and the entire Bollywood celebrates, the kings and queens of so-called Bollywood. And I'm like, they're looking at this black man. Would they not get the same inspiration about a black man making it up in the film industry, trying to create a new genre? Should we not look into ourselves reflectively and see, have we kept equivalent of black characters in our movies suppressed? And this is the kind of irony that they live in, where they are happy to embrace a black achievement or a black talent. But at the same time, they want to make sure that the other stories that will make them uncomfortable remain. And that's why you see the hypocrite Priyanka Chopra, the wife of that singer, Nick Jonas. She claims and decries that there are no South Asian women characters written in. How ironical of you, you have not even managed to engage with the social aspects when you were there back in India talking about this politics. And this is what happens when you engage with the so-called brown color characters who belong to Indian origin, where they present themselves as victims, but their history is totally of a victimizer.
So I want to open the floor to questions. So Professor Wilson.
Yeah, do you have a mic?
Suraj and Khalil, great exchange, really great. So I have a brief comment followed by a brief question. My brief comment is, George Bernard Shaw once said that it's better to be criticized or misunderstood than be ignored. If you're a writer, there's nothing worse than being ignored. Caste Matters certainly has not been ignored. Just keep that in mind. Now here's my brief question. You raised a very interesting point. You stated Gandhi was insistent on maintaining the caste system. That's very interesting. In the United States, Gandhi is revered. We compare Gandhi with Martin Luther King Jr., So it would be great if you would elaborate on that statement, that Gandhi was insistent on maintaining the caste system.
Thank you, Professor Wilson, and appreciate that support. One of the early translations or the biographies of Gandhi was written by a gentleman called C.F. Andrews. C.F. Andrews brought Gandhi to America. And C.F. Andrews was a white man who was invested in I don't know what, but he was a disciple of Gandhi's. And so when Gandhi is brought into the space, there is a duality, about, for example, there is a fight against a white regime, which is colonial in its construct, so you want to find allies in its spaces, right? And then what we tend to look at is this immediate comparisons about the reverence of Gandhi. When Dr. King went to India, when he came back, he gave a series of speeches and he expressed the torments that the untouchables or the people that were living in poorest areas, and he describes very heart-wrenching experiences where he sees people living with their own with their own cows and buffaloes in the same room. And he said, my God, I couldn't imagine this kind of suffering in this place. What people don't know and follow up is when he comes back, he writes a letter to his confidant who was introduced him to, his trip was sponsored by the Quaker Society that they went. And he said, send me any material you have, pen, paper, pamphlets, everything on untouchables. I want to make a serious study of it. And then here we see what happens is when a certain empire projects a certain hero or shiro, there is always an investment of a certain sort where you are not trying to present. Now, MLK is there for approximately 3 weeks odd, and he's not even introduced to the figure like Ambedkar, who is more qualified, has more education, as well as one of the prominent leaders. But African American press since 1930s reports on the activities of Ambedkar and the untouchables, in the Pittsburgh Courier, New York Amsterdam News. I'm doing the archival study, and they profile him as to what is happening. The caste system for Gandhi and many other people was almost a distant experience. So what he would say is because he got 2 manual scavengers, the Dalits who would clean the shit into his what they call ashram space to as a gesture to say that I am in support of that. And of course he also led the fight against this caste system, but he didn't lead the fight against abolishing the caste system persistent, because if you abolish it, where would Gandhi go? So Gandhi would give the sermons like saying, if in my next life I want to be born as an untouchable, whereas we say, shall we wait until you die and being born as an untouchable so that we get a revered figure? So this kind of patronization that continues to happen and suppressing the voices. And he was the guy who is responsible for the political slavery of India's Dalits. There's no other person who is responsible for ensuring the tokenized forms or the subjugated form of Dalits, because he fasted unto the death. So we all have his famous fasting and creating a moral action. He fasted against the rights granted to untouchables as independent political entities in the country. He said, I will give my life if Dalits are granted the political independence. Instead, he compromised on the shared seats, which becomes again a formula. If you work in an electoral politics, you become just a member of that cabal. You cannot usher the views. And so in today's context, when we are looking at these issues, we need to scratch the surface and look at where did we committed some of the mistakes, or where did we look or overlooked. And I think that is the perhaps the work of current generation to kind of address those issues and then sort of bring up and interestingly, MLK is as much revered among the Dalit circles, but here Gandhi is removed and Ambedkar is put next to MLK, and I think that's the kind of inspirational politics that takes part into this.
Next question. I had a hand and yes, the necklace. Yes.
Thank you so much for this. I really appreciate this panel and your talks. We talked a little bit about this last week. What are your thoughts on Mayawati? And so Mayawati is the chief minister of a huge state in India, the biggest state, most populous, very powerful state, terribly, terribly poor. I have my own opinion about her because I visited Uttar Pradesh and saw hospitals that received no funding during her tenure. And meanwhile, you go outside and there are statues that she made in her own likeness, like a row of them. It's surreal. So those statues were built for 2,000 crore. If anyone can calculate that in dollars for us, that would be great. But that's just an example of the extreme corruption that I've seen. And she was an extremely powerful Dalit chief minister, extremely powerful politician. What are your thoughts on her?
Right. So she talked about Mayawati, who is equivalent of, let's say, during the time Jesse Jackson of the era. So it's almost like one of the persons who represents, and tries to. So there are all kinds of slanderous accusations made against this Dalit politician who's a female, and she comes from a social movement, and she's a chief minister of a very powerful was now, and so people are always trying to find out the faults into her, and one of them is she is corrupt, and the second, another argument that goes by it, that she built her own statues. Now that too are, if you look through a Dalit perspective, especially building up a statue is actually a hammer on a Brahminical idea, where first you don't build the statues of a woman, there are always men who are revered into this Hindu context. There are very few female statues, as you see, especially belonging to the Dalit community. You know, the Dalit community there's almost non-existent. So that is first, where it is an establishing yourself, and she not doing it, but the people asking to do it, and it's an aspiration. She becomes a lively examples or representation of something that many Dalits didn't even dream of in a very short span of time. Second thing, this Dalit political leader is accused constantly is of a corruption, and two, that she is very bossy, and you know, and I always am surprised with the feminists who bring up this argument. Especially I was hanging out with some Brahmin feminists who talk about third world feminism, and they talked about Mayawati being bossy. I say, if you look through a feminist lens, how would you put the context of bossiness into your framing of in especially third world political context? That means even though they are third world feminists, they are still Brahmin at first. So their lens is still very much looking at Mayawati through a very dwarfed sense and not giving the autonomous independent agency. Every political leader in India, and not to give a pass to that, so that's my critique of Mayawati too, is responsible for the state induced corruption that we have. But right now, till now, the case is still in the court. It is not proved that it was a corruption. But the media has given a verdict that she is corrupted. The court has to decide that. If she is corrupt, then I will say yes, she is a corrupt. But as of now, she has not been yet proved. So I'll reserve my argument about that.
I just want to make a quick addendum to this. But he says this in the book, so I'm just extending his answer one step further. Since the Reconstruction period in this country, the moment of emancipation of African American, the narrative of Black corruption and incapacity for leadership has been the justification for either cynicism, skepticism, or real barriers to political representation for Black folks. In every instance since then of failed leadership doesn't become a commentary on broader corruption that happens at every level of government by every community, but yet further evidence of an unearned privilege for an unprepared representative of this stigmatized group. And so that is not to let I don't know her name, Wuti off the hook, but it is to say that without that history, and this is a big part of Suraj's work, is if we're not honest about that history of casteism, then we are looking at these situations through a Brahminical lens, a very narrow focus on the failure of an individual, even if and she may turn out to be very corrupt. This here, yes, and then I'm going to come to the right side over here. Yes, it's right here.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Oh, thank you. Who am I connected to?
Own it, you, yes.
I feel I'm so lucky. My name is Zhi Yingyue, a Asian fellow at Hutchins Center. In fact, I seldom pay attention to the things happen in India. What attracted me here, my personal experience is also from a lower. I come from a small city in mainland China. So share some similar experience with this author. So I think that Caste Matters invokes some similar questions here in the United States and also some questions in China. I personally have academic interest in political participation. So this is, from my perspective, I think that he invoked some underprivileged people, their lives and what system entitled them and what their fate is. So I think it's a universal question and has a general contribution to his thought and his work. So I think that I should say congratulations, and I'm really interested about why you want to settle down and write down this book, and what's your original ideas and what's your pursuit about this book. Thank you so much.
So we're going to take, this will be our last set of questions. So we're going to hear, so that's the question, why did you write the book? Great question, I should have asked it. And we're going to take the gentleman to the right and right here. So since you're here, we'll take our question, and then it's in the last question.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Marty Chen from the faculty here. I grew up in Uttar Pradesh. To dil hai Hindustani. And I work on issues of the working poor. I founded a global movement of workers in the informal economy. And what I see every time I hear about race in this country and caste in India, I know that most of the working poor are from these disadvantaged communities. And we don't have to explore now, but I really want to look at the intersection of informality, caste, and race, because the informal, we have a global alliance of waste pickers, for instance, and of street vendors. And they are seen as undesirables in urban space, and they aren't allowed to occupy urban space or pursue their livelihoods. So we can off the record, but I really see an intersection of these issues, and they get police warrants, they get criminalized, they get put in prison. So I would like to offline, so to speak, explore those intersections. Yes.
And our final comment or question?
Thank you so much for this. So just before I got to Harvard, I'm from Chennai in India. I was reading this op-ed in the Hindu which said that the constitution of India is inherently Brahminical. So what that got me thinking was, is a possible solution to this only through constitutional amendments? I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay, so I'm going to let Suraj answer everything. I'm going to wrap up with those 3 questions, or 2 questions in common. But I do want to just say, in case anyone leaves, that tonight will be a book reception for Suraj at 5 o'clock in the Allison Dining Room, 5th floor of the Taubman Building. 5 o'clock tonight, reception with light hors d'oeuvres, or something, light something. Refreshments, yes, that's it. And then tomorrow is a forum event sponsored by Shorenstein Center, The Politics of Difference, Race, Technology, and Inclusion. That event will take place in the forum, and it will be at 6 o'clock. Okay. Why did you write the book? What?
Yeah, Truth and Transformation. Also in the conference, you say.
Oh, and yes, and on October 16th, the IRA project, Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability, will be hosting a conference called Truth and Transformation, and it will be an all-day conference beginning in the morning, including in the evening with a reception on October 16th. Okay.
Thank you for asking that question, actually. So I wanted to write this book with multiple reasons, but one of the things was, first, this book is rewritten 2 times. First, I wrote in a very philosophical sense. I was very drawing upon Sartre, Plato, and then Heidegger, and the editor said, this is a very important issue at hand, you will lose the readers. The reason I wanted to write this book, one thing was, there are so many issues that right now in these times we are talking and discussing, but about caste, especially in the global context. There is everything, and these are very important issues, especially that affects American empire. That becomes an important narrative for New York Times and the likes of neoliberal institutions, where that issue becomes penultimate, and that's why, and of course, as important as the issue is of Israel and Palestine conflict, more than 250 UN resolutions have been passed in that, in that context, UN General Assembly. India, we have 300 million in contrast. There is no acknowledgement of UN about the existence of this problem. And so I wanted to, usher this voice of the people that do not, unfortunately, do not have access to the institutions like I have. And if I'm having that access, I better use it to, as I call, cultural suicide bombers, and 2, to be someone who can narrate the stories of these people that should become part of our everybody's concern. We can't live the life upon the oppression of people under our nose and eyes without even knowing about it. That's one of the motives, and of course there are various other motives that includes many people. This is not my dissertation that came out of it. I had to write a new book, dissertation somewhere else, and so many people were asking me about why did you not convert a dissertation. My dissertation affects, which is as important it is, the laborers in Africa. But for me, this issue was something, because I'm in conversation with all of these people here, right? And I draw inspiration from them. So let that live thought that we discussed here go into the histories of pages that that book has come about. Thank you for actually see the informal working, and I think this is where many of us need to talk about these issues, especially with the informal, there is, I don't know, there's economic index, which I don't know how to count, but the Dalit labor features one of the highest, because 73 to 74% India lives still in villages. So urbanization is still contrasted in monetary terms. And of that, 72% in rural villages, Dalits live in villages. And so Dalits are the cesspool of growing atrocities because they don't even get reported. Now, if a Dalit woman is raped, the conviction rate is mere 2%. So only 2% of the cases that are even reported get to be, and there are many stories where a woman is raped and the child is born, which is again mixed caste, and there is a whole thinking about what do you do of this, because the father doesn't know because he has raped the Dalit woman and then produced, and this kind of statistics are very mind-boggling for many of us. Looking at that, many Dalits, when they leave rural areas, they go into urban areas and they become urban refugees. They don't have land, they don't have house. So whatever, if you go to big cities, you will see thatched huts or very informal settlement en masse in big cities. These are predominantly occupied by Dalits because of their mass migration. And of course, there are other lower caste groups who continue to identify. But when we talk about this poverty, we don't talk about their caste or their existence. We just talk in a very economical sense without even giving their due agency to their humanity that it so rightfully deserves. Thus, it becomes a very transactional metaphor for us to talk about those poor people, or and that's where I'm trying to, I think, make an intervention. To answer your question, the op-ed was written by someone else, right? Yes, because I also wrote an op-ed on that, and I got a lot of negative. So, I see, Constitution is an interesting existence because it is drafted by Ambedkar, by the way, and so it becomes very close to the Dalits to hold it dear to themselves, and it talks about various living metaphors that we should have in our lifestyle, various directive principles, fundamental rights. But what happens is Constitution becomes a mere reason for Dalits to hope for something, and the oppressors to continue to oppress. So it's living in this very tricky mode. And I am trying to ask a question that Dalits are holding on to the Constitution as well as constitutional values, because the proof is they have not invoked any civil wars in India. In last 10 years, 500,000 crimes are committed against Dalits. I mean, that is a good case for civil war. Dalits have not perpetuated any genocide in India. They are still holding on to the constitutional values, but in contrast, genocide is committed against them. Wars are committed against their entire families and households. So how do you account to that? What is happening? And this is where, going back to Ambedkar, Ambedkar said, Constitution is handled by this oppressive minority. This oppressive minority that uses religion as well as its social status to invert the fundamental radical ideas to its own benefit, so that they can self-nurture and their succeeding generations, and sending the kids, I don't know what caste you belong to, their kids to the foreign institutions, so that they can then usurp and then go back and become the second oppressors in the line.
So I'm going to finish with my version of a translation, because that's a lot. I mean, and it's not easy to follow for an outsider to this history and present. And that is that if you can think of Dr. King being individually, that is just a unfair characterization of the civil rights movement, but for argument's sake, being a singular embodiment of the legislative achievements, which were in their own way a way of making the new Constitution of the post-slavery era, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, have the real legislative power they needed to put an end to 100 years of Jim Crow. Okay, you following me? This would then explain why the Republican Party loves Dr. King, why Dr. King is the first and only African American to have a place on the mall, which was a bipartisan project. And that pointing to Dr. King against the critiques of the Black poor or Black political dissidents, say embodied in Black Lives Matter, as being anti-King. That King gave us the laws that give everyone access to the American dream. And if you follow the laws and play by the rules, then America is great for everyone. For anyone who breaks the law, protests the law, challenges the law, not only are you a criminal, or certainly politically suspect, but you are then disrespecting the legacy of Dr. King. And that legacy of Dr. King that was the dissident after the Civil Rights era, that wrote a new story of what needed to happen after the Civil Rights Movement, has been completely lopped off and discarded. In the same way that Suraj describes Ambedkar's legacy of radicalism and his own displeasure with what the Constitution itself that he helped to write gave us. So it's incredible. It's an invitation for you to buy and read the book yourself so that you can either agree or disagree. Can you join me in giving Suraj a